Hi folks, Matt Easton, Scholar Gladiatoria here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the British infantry officer's sword. I have spoken on this pretty much precise topic before, but I thought I'd do an update video simply because I have an example of a sort of hybrid development in my possession now, which I didn't have when I made the previous video. So for the second half of the 19th century, the British infantry officer's sword looked like this. There were some small variations, but by and large, to summarise, it's a compromise cut and thrust blade, usually slightly curved, very slightly curved. By cut and thrust blade, what I mean is it has a cutting edge that extends from the base all the way up to the tip, and also a cutting edge which extends about 10 to 12 inches down the back, known as the false edge as well. It has a fuller in the blade, the fuller being located towards the back of the blade. It is almost straight, this example. Generally speaking, they start off from about 1845, 1850, when this pattern first came into use. They were a little bit more curved in general, and they generally become straighter as you go on through the 19th century. Particularly by the 1880s, the blades are generally very straight, like this one, and this does date from the 1880s. I've shown before the folding brass guard. You sometimes get a folding section on the inside here to make it more comfortable. That was in use from 1845 until about 1860. Thereafter, they all became solidly brass hilted, like this example here, because the folding section was found to, although it was perhaps a bit more comfortable to wear, it was found to be quite fragile, both in combat and just in general use, and they often became damaged, so they just thought, let's do away with that and just make a solid guard. So there we have the brass hilted regulation infantry officer's sword for the majority of the Victorian period. Now, throughout the Victorian period, there were various attempts at making this into a more effective fighting weapon. There were non-regulation types, of which I have spoken in the past, and I will speak about, I'm sure, again. But there was always a debate, really, about cut versus thrust. From a modern point of view, from looking at the greater scope of sword development and martial arts, this is a kind of a silly debate, because cut versus thrust, why do you have to be exclusively one or the other? Even a rapier, which is very specialised in a way towards the thrust, still has a cutting capacity, and really the only sword in Europe that was in widespread use, so ignoring the estoc, that was in widespread use and that could only thrust, was the small sword. However, in the 19th century, there was a sort of tug of war between those who thought that you should encourage officers and indeed cavalry troopers to predominantly thrust, or indeed only thrust, and those who thought you should have a mixture of cut and thrust. And this is a sort of debate I'm not going to get into now, but it actually goes back further, and it's an unanswerable question. Clearly, thrusts have certain advantages, but cuts have advantages as well. And let's not forget that people's natural inclination usually is to hit, i.e. to cut. Okay, so by the 1890s, by the beginning of the 1890s, they had got to a point where they decided it was time to update the design of the British infantry officer's sword. And the first thing they did was introduce a completely new type of blade, a purely thrusting blade. I will caveat that with you can cut with it, but it is very poor at cutting. And I will speak in a little bit more detail about that in a second. In 1892 they brought in this new blade that was a sort of 95% dedicated thrusting blade. So I'll just grab one of those. Right, so what we have here, if you just try and ignore the hilt for now. So what we have here is an absolutely dead straight blade that tapers. It's the same thickness at the base as the old cut and thrust blade, but it tapers much more rapidly to a point, so it's pretty much a straight direct gradient to the point, whereas you'll see with the old 1845 type blade, whilst it starts the same thickness, it actually stays that thickness for quite a long time, because of course you're wanting to cut with the end of the blade, whereas with this one, it's very, very narrow and you know, quite stout blade, and you're not really going to be able to cut very effectively with the end of the blade there. Okay, so they brought in this thrusting blade in 1892, and British officers weren't obliged to replace the sword that they were using. It was acceptable to keep using your sword until it wore out, or until you fancied changing to the new regulation sword. However, what many officers who wanted to be seen to be up to date did is they ordered the new blade, and they sent in their old sword, and they actually had the old hilt, or the new blade, mounted on their old hilt. And what I should also point out is that in 1892, whilst the new blade, that new straight thrusting blade, had come in, the hilt was still the same. Okay, so we have a strange situation here where the officers have a sort of peer pressure to replace their blades, but not their hilts, and then this must have really annoyed them, because officers had to pay for all of their own gear. In 1895 they came along with a replacement hilt. Okay, so they would have had to send their swords in again and now get a new hilt added to it, and this is the 1895 hilt. Okay, so you'll notice straight away the big difference is it's steel instead of brass. So it's much stronger, it's less likely to get damaged just from dropping it or bashing it, but in combat as well it will protect your hand better, and it is actually a bigger guard. It provides more coverage for your hand, and your hand is more sort of enclosed by it. The holes, whilst they're still fairly large in 1895, are much smaller as well, so thrusts, and bear in mind that they've just replaced it with a straight thrusting blade, thrusts are less likely to get through this new steel guard than the old brass guard. The old brass guard really, which was designed for the cut and thrust style of fencing, and as soon as you have a very point-on line thrust-centric fencing system being used, that becomes a very vulnerable style of hilt to use. And I imagine that they realised lots of people would be getting stabbed in the hand if they fought someone else with a thrusting sword, which, it has to be mentioned, by 1892 would be a very unusual occurrence to happen, because not many officers were fighting each other with swords by 1892. Now, bear in mind that I mentioned it wasn't compulsory to replace your old sword with a new model. However, many officers did, but some held out until 1895, and then in 1895, when the new hilt and the new blade were confirmed, they bought an entirely new sword. So they were the lucky ones, because they hadn't wasted money in 1892 buying a new blade. They just bought a complete new sword in 1895. However, some officers didn't like the new thrusting blade. Either didn't like it or just didn't fancy spending that much money, and so this example is the hybrid I referred to earlier. It is the old cut and thrust blade, this example actually dating from the 1880s, it's Wilkinson, on a 95 hilt, and I think this is a somewhat handsome combination. I personally much prefer the cut and thrust blade to the pure thrusting blade. And you'll notice a lot of modern books written on the development of the British military sword say that the thrusting blade was the sort of the blade that the British officer had been waiting for throughout the 19th century. And this is really just hyperbole and rubbish. It's not based on any actual evidence. It's very clear that when the military endorses or releases a new piece of kit, there is a certain amount of propaganda that goes with it in saying this new piece of kit's really good and you know, much better than the old one. It happens with all equipment, and it happened in the 19th century as well. And in actual fact, as far as what I trust primary accounts of soldiers who used swords. And the problem when judging this blade, the thrusting blade, the 1892 type blade, is really infantry officer swords were used very, very little in the 1890s and after that. There are some examples of this blade being used in the Boer War and indeed in the First World War. However, they're a very small cross-section, very small sample to measure whether this was regarded as a better blade, a better fighting sword, than the old cut and thrust blade. Okay, and in actual fact we know a variety of different opinions on the old cut and thrust, the old 45 cut and thrust blade, because it was used throughout the second half of the 19th century in all sorts of theatres of conflict, in the Crimean War, invasion of China, Persia, Indian Mutiny, Afghanistan, Burma, all over the place, Zulu War and so on. So we have a huge sample of which to judge the 45 blade, and it seems it basically did its job. It wasn't regarded as the best sword in the world, but it killed people. It sometimes lopped pieces off people, and it defended lots of officers' lives. So it kind of did its job. Maybe it wasn't the best blade in the world, but it seems to have been okay. And let's face it, it was so okay that it was retained in use from 1845 right the way through to the 1890s, so actually a pretty long time. And as a blade design, it was also used on cavalry swords throughout the same period, and in fact later carried on in use, and stays in use to this day in the Royal Artillery. So I don't think it's a bad blade design at all. I think it's pretty good, and really complaints about them really came down to, if you actually look at the detail, come down to the quality of the individual blade, whether it was what was known as a tailor-made, that doesn't mean made to suit you, tailor-made, i.e. made for a tailor to sell, which were regarded as low quality because they were just churned out, mass-produced, sold to outfitters, and you bought your sword in that case from the same place as you bought your uniform. What you wanted to do, if you wanted a good sword, is go to a good quality maker like Wilkinson or Pillin or Hawks, or one of these people, or Garden, and then you got a really good quality, proved, tested fighting blade. So to really sum up, the blade that was used throughout most of the second half of the 19th century by infantry officers was the 45 blade. It was replaced in 92 and used thereafter, and is still used to this day, by the straight thrusting blade. The straight thrusting blade was used to cut to some extent, at least if we trust the 1895 manual for its use, which was written by the fencing master Maciello, Italian fencing master, on behalf of the British Army. However, my opinion is that you'd be very, very hard pressed to really cut anything at all with one of these. I have not tried cutting with a sharpened one, but I've cut with enough swords to know that this is not really set up to be a good cutter. The old 45 blade does actually cut pretty damn well. I have a couple of sharp ones, and they cut as well as some medieval swords do, in fact. And one final thing I should mention, of course, is, so I mentioned this is the 1895 guard. What I have here on the other side is the 1897 guard, and the only real change that happened between 95 and 97 is you'll notice that the inside edge there got turned up. And that was simply because people were complaining about the fact that this edge was wearing through the fabric of clothing when the sword was being worn, and was perhaps a bit uncomfortable against the hip as well. This edge is obviously designed to prevent that from happening. Also, you'll notice that the holes on the 97 guard are very fractionally smaller than the holes on the 95 guard. So presumably there was some criticism about the holes being too big, and that a point of one of these new pointy blades could go through those, so they closed up those holes as well. And the final thing I'll mention is, aside from the guard, the thing that really changed between the 45 style hilt, the brass hilt, and the 95 was that the back strap became much straighter up this back edge, very straight up here, and I don't know if you can see that, there we go. you'll see that it's very flat just here for a place for you to put your thumb, and the whole back here is checkered. A criticism of this one was that this back strap was quite slippy in the grip, and certainly if your hands were sweaty or indeed bloody, your hand could slip around on it. So this was really designed, this one was designed to have as much friction as possible and to be as flat as possible, so you could get it in that sabre grip like that with the thumb along the back. Okay, hope that helps and is of interest to some of you. Take care, see you soon.